So welcome everyone to Sacred Priorities, Action, the Social Justice Agenda for the Incoming NYC Administration.
I'm Serene Jones, president here at
Union Theological Seminary.
And it is my pleasure to welcome you, a few of you in person, and to the many that are online, to this morning's important discussion. As we are all aware, New York City is on the eve
of a significant political transition,
which we believe presents a unique opportunity to discuss a new social justice
agenda in the city.
one committed to making New York City a more just and equitable place to live and to work, keep healthy and to thrive, and to inhabit safe, good
homes,
and feel respected and
valued wherever you go. As a part of this commitment to create
more just New York.
Today, we are bringing together a diverse array of religious leaders, policymakers, community activists, and theological and social science scholars to examine, debate, and engage in collaborative problem solving around a wide range of social justice matters. At Union, we strongly believe that including religious, spiritual, and ethical perspectives in this conversation is essential and necessary if that vision is to be a vibrant and inclusive vision for New York. Union was established nearly 200 years ago as a New York City seminary from the start, in the midst of what the founders recognized and called the greatest and most growing community in America. The founders of this school forged a new vision for theological education at the time, to center ministerial training in an urban context so that academic excellence and personal leadership and faith might respond to and be immersed in the needs of the city. At that time, New York City offered a microcosm of some of the most pressing and complex issues of that day: an unprecedented influx of immigrants, a disturbing rise in poverty and escalating health disparities, the development of deeply racist policies, as well as growing racial resistance to them. Policing, housing, health, education, and cultural justice were all critical issues when the school was founded, and still today, New York City remains very much at the center of this moment's most pressing and complex social challenges: health and income disparities, and critical public policy issues. 5 years ago, Union launched the Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice as a focal point for programming that faces into these issues. The mission of the center is to be a venue and a vehicle for engaging local communities in and around New York City in the work of social justice. This event very much advances that mission. And it is a truly collaborative effort with the NYU Robert F. Wagner's Graduate School of Public Service and its NYC 2025 initiative. My colleague, Dean Sherry Glead, will shed more light on their work. I look forward to the conversation that will follow and the rest of the morning, and hopefully the work that goes beyond this. So I would like to introduce Sherry Glead to come to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Jones. Hello, everyone. I'm Sherry Glead. I'm the Dean of the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at NYU, and I am so delighted to be here. Those of you on the Zoom can't see what a magnificent room we are in here in the chapel here at Union. Thank you to Union Theological Seminary and its Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice, our host and partner in this really exciting event. Thank you to our speakers, our panelists, the faculty, and all the New York City 2025 authors and advisory board members for your part in this effort. Thank you for being here. in the room with us, and the many of you, we can't see you, we don't know where you are, but you're watching virtually. Our mission at Wagner is to prepare public service leaders to translate ideas into actions that have an effective and lasting impact on the public good. Wagner's NYC 2025 project is an effort to do just that. NYC 2025 is a collection of more than 24 thoughtful, forward-looking proposals laying out a practical path for the next mayor and city council to follow to ensure that we have a more inclusive post-pandemic recovery for all. After a year of uncertainty and tragedy, the new administration is going to have its work cut out for it. COVID has taken an overwhelming toll on our residents and our economy, and these blows have hit low-income and Black and Hispanic communities in our city particularly hard. New York City's government will need to address these challenges in the context of a very different set of circumstances and threats than existed just a year and a half ago. Post-COVID-19, improving the well-being of all New Yorkers requires policies that first build a prosperous and economically dynamic city, and also, and at the very same time, address economic and racial equity. We can't separate these two agendas. In addition to our proposals, NYC 2025 is excited to partner with different entities and organizations to bring our papers to life and really to engage in dynamic conversations about the best path forward. Union Theological Seminary makes for both an interesting and an exciting partner. It's a theology school focused on social justice with a real history of progressive ideas and an emphasis on interreligious engagement. And like us at NYU, we always say that we are in and of the city, and Union is very much that as well. We are delighted to engage with Union's theology scholars and faith leaders who are connected to urban work and who understand the complexity and contradictions that are entrenched in this city and who are deeply engaged in social justice issues and policies. We look forward to today's conversation as it helps to further New York City on the road to recovery. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dean Glead, and we are very excited to be working with NYU and NYC 2025 on this. And I am excited that our first panel conversation is entitled Social Justice and the City, Perspectives from Religion, Spirituality, and Theology. And I'm pleased to introduce our participants. The Reverend Michael Livingston is our moderator. He is a very close neighbor and the interim senior minister for the Riverside Church, which he joined in 2014 as executive minister. He previously served in a variety of leadership roles at the International Council of Community Churches and the National Council of Churches, as well as at Princeton Theological Seminary. We won't hold that part against him. Our panelists today are from our faculty here at Union, the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cruz, Associate Professor of Religion and Society. Sam, thank you for coming. And the Reverend Dr. Andrea White, Associate Professor of Theology and Culture. Andrea, thank you for doing this morning's conversation. So, Reverend Livingston, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Serene. May I call you Serene? We're neighbors in lots of ways. And I want to get right to our panelists. Their time is limited, so we're going to begin with opening statements by both of them. Dr. Cruz, how about you taking the lead here?
Okay. In order to approach a new social justice agenda for the American city, we must first examine how cities have been regarded in our country and reflect upon existing conceptualizations of justice in the city as envisioned through the lens of white liberal progressive ideology. In popular cultural and political conceptualizations, cities have often been viewed as far from the most suitable or desirable places for a family to live a quality life. They have been considered to be crime-riddled, dirty, roach-infested, and congested. Very little has been mentioned about the fact that cities have generated more than 70% of U.S. GDP. Cities are not only the economic engines of our society, but also the cultural and political centers of our society. The success of democratic elections depends on cities. Like all social phenomena, negative perspectives of cities have always been countered with their contradictions, and their contradictions have been exposed. For example, in recent years, white middle and upper middle class communities have decided that cities are indeed desirable places in which to live, and these groups have moved into cities in large numbers. Some of the stereotypical and racist narratives about people who reside in cities have been intentionally countered by financial stakeholders. Anthropologist Arlene Davila from NYU has demonstrated that the neoliberal city has found ways to commodify and curate Latinx and Black culture to attract gentrification. Not coincidentally, this commodification and curation are offered without the Black and brown bodies present. Therefore, despite the fact that cities have historically been considered to be undesirable places in which to live, in recent years it has become quite trendy to live in them, especially for Euro-Americans who have previously abandoned city living to raise their children in the suburbs. Cities have also become objects of consumption for mostly white consumers. Just gentrification has been accelerated in many major cities. The rents and values of homes as a result of gentrification have become so high that even police officers cannot afford to live in the very same cities that they are policing. Ironically, police protection has predominantly served those citizens and entities who have caused the dislocation of thousands in US cities. Cities have proven to be desirable places for winning elections, bolstering our GDP, and experiencing cultural enrichment, all while the urban working class citizens have been completely neglected. In light of these realities, how do we move from a mimicking of social justice in the city to an authentic justice seeking in the city?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join this conversation, and thank you to my moderator and fellow panelists. It's great to be here. I want to have us think a little bit about what I might call a subway theology. I'm a native New Yorker, and I'm a big lover of the city. And my students in my systematic theology class know that when I talk about the ontological continuum of being, I always give those subway rats a place on that continuum. So, but I actually have something else in mind to think about in this theology of the subway. I want to talk about what it means to live with a conflict of interpretations. And I think you know what I mean if you've ever tried to get on the subway, if you're a native New Yorker or if you've lived here for a long time, you know the proper etiquette for waiting on the platform before you enter the subway car. You know that you stand to the side to let people off and before you get on, as you're living with people who don't know this proper etiquette for getting on the subway. But this conflict of interpretation, this subway theology that I'm calling, is a reflection of a larger divide, a national political divide that affects our city. It's not new, but it's perhaps subject to a forgetfulness about the ways in which many things are entangled. The politics and economics, politics and religion and race are all entangled, and religion is actually everywhere. We have a faith in the market. We have faith in politics. We have a faith that our subways will arrive on time. We have faith in white supremacy. We even have faith in the religious legitimacy granted to violence and police brutality. And in the aftermath of 2016, in the aftermath, or not the aftermath, in the very present moment of living with our pandemic, we are inclined to engage in an analysis that for theologians sometimes functions like a theodicy, like a project to justify God in the face of political and social evil. In other words, why do bad things happen to good citizens? And sometimes theologians are inclined to urge, if not insist, on prophetic proclamation. Maybe what we're seeing is not more doses of white supremacy, but the big reveal is the impact of the pandemic on our city that is a black light. Thank you. A black light that illuminates rather a neoliberal blindness, to death-dealing realities that have always already been here and are hard at work. We can, in retrospect, connect all the dots that led us here to this moment of our struggling city. But we're on a precipice, we're on a threshold as we await a new administration. And there's an ironic contradiction at play. In our city politics, we're engaging on the one hand in a corporate denial, a denial about racism, a denial about the ecological crisis and environmental disaster. And on the other hand, we're engaging in a kind of hyper-seeing that creates a culture of surveillance and policing and regulating of bodies, especially on the basis of race and gender and sex and documents and immigration status. And one of the solutions is not an evangelistic activism to convert the other side in this conflict of interpretations, but the very beginning requires addressing our fundamental fear, our fear of difference. And part of the problem is that we think of difference in normative, hierarchical, oppositional terms. We think different means opposite. And as soon as we set up a binary, we create antagonism and hierarchy. Self-righteousness and demonization are built right into the structure. It's built right into our decisions about where we sit on the subway car relative to who else is in the space. We have no idea how to live with this conflict of interpretations in our politics. We think unity means sameness, and more precisely, we think they must think the same as us. And this naturally generates a political mindset of tribalism and nativism. Tribalism casts members of the opposing party not as worthy adversaries, but as dangerous enemies, as one journalist puts it. So I want to suggest that we take a key for our interpretation of conflict, our fear of difference, from James Cone, the father of Black theology, who was here at Union Theological Seminary for 49 years. He granted hermeneutical privilege to the dispossessed. And this means that we are putting others in a place of privilege and not just simply considering a marginalized existence, but a recentering of what is driving our political agendas. And maybe you know the line, every generation must accomplish democracy over again for itself, that John Dewey gave us. So I want to leave us with a quick word from Hannah Arendt in an essay she wrote for The New Yorker back in 1967. She says, "We remain unaware of the actual content of political life, of the joy and the gratification that arises out of being in a company with our peers, out of acting together and appearing in public, out of this inserting ourselves into the world by word and deed, thus acquiring and sustaining our personal identity and beginning something entirely new." Her remarks include a lament, but also a hope. And I would say a hope born of lament is actually a protest. And protest is also a form of hope. And that is this word from a theologian. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those very provocative comments. It's clear that you've given a lot of thought to the city in the work that you do. If you reflected on the three questions that we thought we might discuss during this period, what I'm going to do is combine the last two in what remains of our time. So could you think about, from your own discipline, some particular theory or concept that would be useful in this moment to help inform public debate and discourse around the kinds of issues that are facing the city? And what would you say to an incoming administration? What would you say to a public, a city, a populace, as it tries to profoundly increase the quality of living that we're engaged in here? Is there something from your own area, a particular concept or lesson learned over the course of the development of thought in theology and church and in society in your case, that would that would be of particular use at this moment as we see a new administration coming into New York City?
I would say that based on experience and thinking about this for years, what a Christian theological perspective could offer is, or one of the things it could offer is to have real commitment to the poor and the marginalized. And what I mean by real, I guess I would have to figure out how to explain it, but I mean not just creating ideas so that you look like you're doing social justice. For example, the biggest one for me that is evident in the way I look at it, this notion of sanctuary cities that people like to talk about. Sanctuary is interesting that we're willing to give sanctuary in the city to people who we really can't do anything for, because immigration is a federal issue. But cities are usually places of hell for the majority of the working class and poor people. So we give sanctuary to those who we really can help. So it helps us to think that we're doing something. But it's almost like a fake idea, this notion of sanctuary, because if you live in New York City, most people are having to rent rooms in their apartments to people they don't know just so that they could have a place to live. Homelessness is rampant. The citizens of the city don't consider the city a sanctuary. So I think and I would also say that I learned from Latin American liberation theology is that we need to be ideologically suspicious of the ideologies. For example, I'm suspicious of the notion of sanctuary city because I know that the people who are citizens are not viewing the city as a sanctuary. Gentrification is rampant in New York City. People can't afford rent. The police who police the gentrifiers, who work for really the gentrifiers, don't even realize that they can't afford to live here themselves. So we really need sanctuary in the city.
Thanks. So I'd like us to think a little bit about food insecurity and the way in which approaching the question of food insecurity actually requires, from a legislative, administrative policy approach, it actually requires a kind of paradoxical mindset. There are two things that work in addressing food insecurity through a theological lens. And one is to recognize, on the one hand, that this is a social justice issue. It's a concern for all of us. It's a concern that's rooted in structures and systems on the one hand, but on the other hand, through a theological lens, we're also called to recognize the personhood and humanity of individual lives. And so both of these things have to be held together, and this is the way social justice impacts our thinking. We're actually called to hold these two things in tension. Theologians are comfortable with paradox, and I think it's a little bit more difficult for those who are policymakers to live with this paradox, but I want to propose that maybe we understand the tension a little bit more.
We have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to give you each about a minute and a half to offer some closing remarks. And perhaps as a jumping off place, this is getting out of the classroom for both of you. We're engaging a larger public, a different public, but what's your responsibility, your commitment, your perspective on how you get your students out of the classroom and into an engagement with these kinds of questions about, especially at Union, the kind of challenges that face us in the city?
One of the things that I do from a practical perspective is send the students out to do what I call a walking census of different neighborhoods in New York City. And I do that because I want the students to understand that everything that takes place in the city, which is very positive for our society, is done with more intensity and creativity. Space, or the lack of it, gives birth to diversity and fertile thinking. If it wasn't for cities, we wouldn't have diversity the way we do. In fact, if it wasn't for cities, I don't think we would have interreligious engagement theology. Because people in cities are forced to live with each other, people of different faiths, different colors, although there are always problems, we know that, but they do it. It has to be done, and it takes place like it doesn't happen in other parts of our country. If we go to the suburbs, people are able to stay enough away from each other not to have to deal with each other. The space or lack of it gives birth to diversity, fertile thinking. You see sacred symbols all over the city. When I send my students out, I say, take a picture of everything that's religiously significant to you. And sometimes we even have grocery stores that the name of the grocery store is the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So how people use their space in cities. There's the creolization of culture, interethnic relationships that don't happen in other places. Here in the city, you could have bands that are made up of Dominican and Haitian musicians, while in the island of Hispaniola, you don't have those relationships between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So cities are a wonderful place to learn how to do theology, or to do Christianity, or to do Buddhism, or to do whatever tradition you're doing. It's done differently. So it's one of the emphasis I have for my students.
And very quickly, I'll just say that one of the themes that comes up in my field of study in womanist theology is the suffering Black body. And I am very excited when I get to take my students to museums where we actually counter this reduction of the Black body to suffering with depictions of Black life as creative and flourishing and depicted in art. So art is very, very important. And it can be a counter-cultural act against the victimized bodies that we see before us on the street, on the subways, all the time.
Well, thank you both so very much. It's your students are fortunate to have you leading them in this kind of deep thinking about issues that are critical for us today. And the city is fortunate to have Union here, where all of this kind of fertile thinking and is going. So thank you very much for your comments this morning, and thank you all for being present. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, Andrea, and Sam, for those reflections. For those of you who are just joining us, I want to welcome you to Sacred Priorities, Faithful Action, a social justice agenda for the incoming NYC administration. Now, it is my honor and privilege to welcome our special keynote speaker today, New York's Lieutenant Governor, and previously New York State Senator who represented our neighborhood here, as well as Harlem and other parts of northern Manhattan. We know him well. We have worked with him for years, and we couldn't be more thrilled by his taking on this new position, which brings into conversation and perspective the place of New York City in New York State as a whole and all of the challenges that are there. So, Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin, we are happy to have you with us. It's a great honor, and he's going to offer us some remarks before descending from on high and actually joining in a panel discussion with others who are with us this morning. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions when the panel concludes its remarks. So, Lieutenant Governor, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here at the Social Justice in the American City, Sacred Priorities, Faithful Action conversation. And we really got off to a great start, so I'm honored to be a part of this. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, Reverend Fred Davey, and as well Reverend Eli Valentine for helping to put this together and bringing us to this beautiful James Chapel. If you're online, I know you wish you could be here with us. This is a beautiful space. And I also want to say thank you to the Dean of the NYU Wagner, Sherry Glead, for her remarks and her partnership in this important effort. And obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our former borough president, Ruth Messenger, and NYU Wagner's Martha Stark, who have been two spectacular public servants. Let me first start and say a few words about COVID. It was mentioned earlier. We are taking serious action to prevent the spread and combat this epidemic. There are a number of important factors that we are dealing with. One is that as you look across the state, there are some different factors that we're dealing with. And in some parts of our state, there is an active participation from some to not get the vaccination. That is creating some very significant issues, particularly as it relates to positivity rates. We are seeing across the state a direct correlation between low vaccination rates and higher positivity rates. And when you come to now New York City and Manhattan, where we are, where the rate right now, positivity rate now is about 1.6%, and you think about how dense we are, the only real answer as to why we don't have a lot more COVID, Delta variant, et cetera, sort of proliferating in our part of the state is because we're vaccinated, we're getting boosters, and we're doing all the right things. And so we're working to make sure that we spread that effort around the state. Omicron is here, as many of you know. We have detected 14 cases thus far. We expect that there is more, but quite frankly, from a hospital standpoint, the Delta variant is really what's driving some issues there. We have issued an executive order to sort of require hospitals that have capacity issues with beds to sort of put off elective surgeries for now. We know that's a financial issue for some hospitals, but we have to make sure we have capacity to provide critical services across the state. We have had a rough year and a half plus with COVID, and many of us are going to have to be wearing masks for the foreseeable future, but just know that at the government, at the state level, we're doing our best to address this. And we are doing our best to work with the city. One of the comments that I continue to hear as I travel around the state is, and particularly around New York City, is what is going to be the new dynamic with cities and municipalities. We, as you look at how we're dealing with COVID and as we're dealing with a number of issues, we believe that the state and the city must have partnerships on every important factor in front. And when you talk about what we're discussing here today, which is social equity, social justice, and community engagement, there's no place where that's more needed and more relevant. And so we will continue to do that going forward. You know, in my history, personally, I have been very much a believer that public-private partnerships, and when I say public-private partnerships, I mean that literally, are the path to success. The government, the private sector, and academia all working together to bring ideas and bring real-life experiences to address some of the key issues that we're dealing with in the day. That, to me, is the path forward. And so when we talk about what you're doing here today and what you're launching, and making sure that the sort of spiritual religious perspective is in that conversation, I think that's very important. You know, I grew up hearing a lot of times in the political space, there's a separation between church and state, but I went to church every Sunday, all right? And I don't know how it's possible to not think about how we infuse our personal values and what we learn and deal with every day within the constructs as public servants with how we try to govern and how we try to make sure that we prepare and provide the right inclusive decisions for everyone. Union Seminary. This conversation is so important. You have a long tradition of not only non-denominational, but also being multicultural. From early on, you embraced different ideas and different people, and you've always made our city not only about location for your ministry, but about all of us. Union continues this today, still making first, still widening the circle of who gets heard and who is included, which I'll come back to in a little bit. First female president, Dr. Jones, growing relationships with other schools like the Jewish Theological Seminary, Columbia, and NYU, welcoming the Episcopal Divinity School into the fold, making sure that LGBTQ faith leaders know that their voices matter and they're part of the conversations. That is the kind of progressive, bold leadership that we expect, and that is what helps to break down barriers. And so I want to thank Union for what you have been doing on that front. And then let me talk about NYU. You know, this school, the Wagner School, for some of you who might not know, I actually was considering, before going to business school, I was considering going to public policy school. And Wagner was one of the places that I was considering. I hadn't gone into business school, so don't be mad at me for that. But I do think it's so important, particularly after Trump's election, where so many people were trying to figure out, what can I do to get involved and make a difference? Some folks who've already lived lives and done things elsewhere, who want to be a part of the conversation, it is our opportunity within the state to figure out those opportunities. And I believe this conversation, and I also believe schools like Wagner are essential to that piece. And so I would continue to recommend and ask that we continue to have some of these groundbreaking joint ventures and activities. Let's continue to push the envelope because that is where some of our best ideas will come from. You know, one of the things that I was speaking to the incoming mayor, Eric Adams, about the other day was that, you know, as elected officials, particularly at his level, and to a lesser degree at mine, we are constantly moving all over the city, all over the state, addressing so many different issues. And it's important that we get the best advice. And so the question is, how do you structure that, right? One of the ways you deal with that is who you're listening to, right? So who are your top staff members? In the case of the mayor, as you know, he has a transition committee. That committee is helping him to formulate who will become his key administrators. But the more important question is, who is he listening to? And what are they saying to him? And how the conversation in the public is being narrated and facilitated. Unfortunately, in my view, I believe too much of the conversation is driven through media, driven through what is sort of the issue of the day, whether it's the gotcha moments of the day or it's talking about issues like public safety in ways that don't talk about the fundamental concerns, but are more about the political angles of it, which makes it difficult for us to dig into some of the weeds. You know, one of the things that I was working closely with Martha Stark on was trying to talk about how we look at property taxes and looking at it from an issue of fairness, right? Property tax is not the most sexy topic, but when you talk about it from a fairness standpoint and about who's benefiting and who's not, it really comes into a social economic justice and also a racial justice matter. Because if you look at how redlining has impacted the country and how who has gotten what parcels of land and how that was determined, you have so much infused in that needs to be unwound and unpacked. And as we are making decisions going forward at the state and the city level, we are taking those issues into consideration to facilitate restorative justice and restorative equity. That has to be the issue of the day. And so let me close on the following. We have a federal government that is going to be raining money into this country. Okay, $1.2 trillion has just been decided for infrastructure. We're going to get our fair share of that, a significant fair share of that. Public housing, NYCHA is going to get about $20 to $25 billion of that. The question is, what does it go to do and who is doing it, right? the Second Avenue subway is going to be extended from 96th Street to 125th Street. There is so much poverty and economic despair right along the lines of taking that train from 96th Street to 125th Street. Who's trained for those jobs? Which small businesses are going to get some of the key contracts for those jobs? That is part of what I believe government has to be focused on if we're going to be talking about equity in a real way. I believe that economic restoration is an important component to what we need to be focusing on, and I am very much interested in doing that as the Lieutenant Governor. And there's a number of other issues, but I wanted to sort of leave it there so that we can have a conversation that is really based upon some things that I think we absolutely have to focus on as a government. Let's be very clear about who is getting the opportunities to rebuild this country. Let's be clear, you know, and I don't want to get too controversial here. You know, people of color, particularly African Americans, built this country for free. And so when we start talking about building back better, we need to make sure that the people who have been historically shut out, historically left out, and historically undermined are put in a position to really sort of have opportunities for their families, have opportunities for their communities, and to help us to change the economic conversation, which I believe can be a domino effect with some of the other important social ills that we're dealing with. So with that, thank you for having me here today. I look forward to being a part of this conversation moderated by the one and the only Ruth Messenger. And, you know, as a former senator for this district, you're doing really well, and I look forward to continuing to be a friend as we move forward over time. Thank you.
I'm gonna train your, I'm gonna switch your room. Okay.
Oh.
Trying to keep everyone a little socially distanced.
Oh, makes sense. How are you?
So thank you, Lieutenant Governor Benjamin, for those remarks. Yes, property tax is a social justice issue and a faith issue. As you rightly remark, how do we make sure that the labor that actually went into constructing this amazing city and the communities whose labor was extracted from them to build this city remain in this moment at the center of the conversation about how we rebuild it. So that is also a deeply ethical and moral issue that we need to keep front and center. I'm so excited that you're joining this panel entitled Social Justice and New York City, From the Past to the Future. I am very excited to introduce, as Lieutenant Governor referred to her, the one and only, our moderator, Ruth Messenger, who is currently a social justice fellow at Jewish Theological Seminary. And if you're looking for someone who has a long history leading on social justice issues from the ground to the very highest level, in New York City government, in one role as a borough president, and as someone who has worked in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector as well as the religious sector. If you described this person in the abstract, you might not believe they could possibly exist, but they do in Ruth Messenger. We're also pleased to have with us Bishop Ray Rivera. Ray, great to have you here, a good friend of Union's as well. He is the founder and president at the Latino Pastoral Action Center and senior pastor of Sanctuary Church. Just a quick word here for those of you who are joining us from the press. We'll be taking questions. You can either write them on a card or with your name and affiliation, or type them into the chat function of the webinar. So again, welcome to those who are just now joining us online, and I'm going to turn it over to Ruth to begin our second panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all of you online. I know there are many of you out there. I just said to my friend Martha, of course, some of them are trying to feed their children breakfast or get somebody out of the house, but I know what that's like because I do a lot of that myself. It's my privilege to be here with the bishop and the lieutenant governor. I think we make a nice picture of New York up here.
That's true.
I wanted to say a couple of really personal thank yous. First of all, as you heard in the introduction, I am now the inaugural Finkelstein Social Justice Fellow at the Jewish Theological Seminary. My boss and colleague is Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, who is the executive director of the Handel Center for Ethics and Justice at JTS. And for those of you who want to know how to shape a future career, Stephanie's first job was working for me, and now I work for her. But I am also really pleased to be at Union. I want to thank David for all of his logistical puttings up with me, and to say a particular and strong hello to my friend Fred Davey. Fred and I have worked together, I think now, for 40 years, off and on panels and whatever. He was a distinguished deputy borough president, and we like very much being united in the interfaith faith communities and working across the road from each other. And I want to welcome my close colleague, Chloe Breyer, whom most of you know, Reverend Chloe Breyer, who is the director of the Interfaith Center of New York, whose board I'm pleased to have actually stayed on. And then I really want to thank a huge thank you to the Wagner School NYC 2025. I've been around so long that Martha also used to work for me, but you know, these things just happen. But what I want to say about the NYC 2025 panel is, like, Martha and I had a few emails back and forth when she asked me to be on the task force. And one of my concerns, to be honest, was that everybody has some idea of what should happen in fill in the blank: housing, education, transportation, street safety, criminal justice. The question is, how are we going to get the experts, help them shape their contributions so that they're useful to government? And then what are we going to do to get the people who come into new positions in government this January, first of all, to read them, but second of all, to think seriously about them and how they might implement them? And that's really a little bit of what this panel is about. And so the first wisdom of the Wagner School NYC 2025 effort was, like, saying very clearly, this is all the work we're doing is targeted to the people who get elected and who are going to be running the city. Second thing they did was to reduce, and I hope you've gone on their website, every policy paper to a summary. It's not to say that elected officials don't read. We never say that. But anyway, having a summary is a good idea, and having a summary that emphasizes action steps is a good idea, a very good idea. And the third thing that's really important to me, and then we'll get to the point of the panel, is that in a lovable, sometimes slightly tense back and forth among the panel of the task force, the commitment over and over again was to post-COVID revival and economic development as central to the life of any city or state, and certainly to New York. But let's do it with a real commitment to equity. So I just want to say again and again to each one of us and in our lives, there's a desperate need and hope to get back to normal. First of all, there's no getting back. We've all been through, I don't know if you saw today's Times, but the life story of the mental health of 10 to 16-year-olds is just devastating, as we might imagine it would be. So it's not just getting back, it's getting through and re-emerging. But I think more important than that, as we struggle for these next steps, whatever they are, we need to remember that things in New York City, the place that we really love, were not okay.
That's right.
They were not okay for people of color, they were not okay across race lines, they were not okay across class lines. And sometimes they were just not okay. The systems don't work well. It's not only that they work in a discriminatory and racist fashion, which is true, sometimes they just don't work well. So we have a lot to do, and that's why the focus of this panel, nicely worded, thank you, is social justice, how do we do it? So the questions that David sent me made me laugh, because it was like, could you give some examples of how social justice change has worked in New York in the past, how it's working now, and what it might work, what it might take in the future? And my answer to all three of those questions is everything. You know, it's throw it out and try to make it work. That's the first answer. And the second answer, which I just cannot stress clearly enough, is organizing. Okay, this is not, for some of us, this cannot be an occasional activity. It's dedicated thought. If you like the press points in changing transportation in the NYC paper, if you, as some of us up here, really want to make the health system in this city less racist, you know what? It's not going to happen because Union and the Wagner School believe it should. It's not going to happen because a lot of us would like to see things different. It's going to happen because we do all the things that will make it different. And those things, folks, take time. So I'm going to ask Bishop Breyer, who has not a speaking chance at all, to say a little bit more about himself and his commitment and what he sees in the way of social change. Then ask the Lieutenant Governor to say some of the same. And then I will surprise you to know I have a few thoughts of my own. Bishop.
Yes, thank you. I'm just inspired to be here. Many people in the audience are personal friends of mine. Fred Davey was one of the first funders when he was at the Ford Foundation that funded the Latino Pastoral Action Center. COE, I work with constantly as director of the Interfaith Center. Professor Cruz is a longtime friend. I knew him when he was a young leader in Sunset Park. And Eli also is one of the persons that I've humbly have been an influencer in his life. So I'm just excited to be here. Thank you, Dr. Serena, for your leadership. And Ruth Messenger, I'm going to date myself.
It's okay. I'm so dated, you know. I'm from Generation A.
Monday, I was 75 years old. So Ruth Messenger was one of the voices when I was growing up. So I'm going to try to give, for lack of a better term, an indigenous perspective on that question. And it was 1961, and I was a young man, had dropped out of high school, was pretty much being impacted by all of the social ills of the society. And I had a conversion experience in a storefront Pentecostal church. That conversion experience led to me going to a Bible school. You didn't need a bachelor's to get into the Bible school because they were indigenous Bible institutes started by the local church. I graduated, and in the Pentecostal tradition, the next year they put me to pastor a church. I was 19 years old, and it was in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. We didn't have any money, so of course I had to support myself. Again, dating myself, my first job was as community organizer in the War on Poverty, Johnson. And most political activity, contrary to popular opinion, because there's mainstream history, then there's indigenous history, which is the real history. Most of our early politicians came out of the anti-poverty program. Serrano, Ramon Vélez, Ruth remembers these names, Angelo Del Toro, Robert Rodriguez. These were all products of organizing as a result of the anti-poverty program, and the anti-poverty program became the equivalent of what the district club had been for the traditional Democratic Party. So it was the anti-poverty program that became the catalyst for a generation of Hispanic and Latino politicians. In the midst of that conversion experience, I got my job, and they assigned me to organize welfare recipients. So in the daytime, I was organizing welfare recipients, Ruth, and I would say, "We can change the system now." And I would yell out, "We can change the system," and say now, and everybody said now. But at night, since I was Pentecostal and my theology was eschatological, we believed in the coming of Christ, the imminent coming of Christ, I would tell the people, no, we can't do anything. We have to wait for the coming of Christ. So that produced in me this duality. In the morning, I was saying we can change it now, but at night I was saying, no, we got to wait for the coming of the Lord. So it was that duality, it was that paradox that helped me to ask the question, does the gospel respond to individual transformation and systemic transformation? Has the gospel that I accepted respond to those two dimensions? I said, well, there must be answers. I didn't get it in the Bible Institute, so that led me to another seminary in the city, Union Theological, and to an alumni. There was probably the white person that has most influenced my life, Bill Weber, who was a professor of church and society at Union. And it was there that I began to wrestle with this dichotomy between the personal and the systemic. That led to now, I've been a pastor 55 years in New York City. I've developed my own theological perspective, which I call Captivity Theology, and I'll just say a couple of words about that. I believe that the covenant community, the Jewish community, unfolds in captivity. Egyptian captivity, Persian captivity, Babylonian captivity, and in the New Testament, Roman captivity. So the covenant community, the Jewish community, is always in a situation of captivity. So my question is, if we're in a situation of captivity, then how do we minister? How do we do social justice in that situation? Some call it empire. I like the name captivity better because Pentecostals are more biblical. No, I'm just teasing. So we have a biblical language. So how do we minister in a situation of captivity? And I'll end with my book, Liberty to the Captives, if you want to flesh it out more. It's become a book that's given Pentecostals and evangelical people of color a language, because these seminaries do a great job. NYTS did it for me. It challenged me of deconstructing a colonial theology. The problem is they don't reconstruct one. So then you have a tension because people of color coming out of their own theology that's usually conservative and evangelical and indigenous, once they get deconstructed, they're looking for a language to do social justice. And sometimes the language that's given in these dominant culture institutions don't reflect that language. They don't feel comfortable with that language. So I'll end with this. I have 4 paradigms: engaging your community, confronting your community, engaging the powers, confronting the powers. So I'll flesh that out if you want some questions, but engaging the community, that means our own community. Sometimes we have to challenge. I'll give it one example. Is Livingston still here? Yes. William Kaufman was a friend of mine, so I'm dating myself. And there was a big conference in your church in the 70s, a national conference. And I was invited. Ben Alisea was just a kid. Sam Sullivan was just a kid. They were all disciples of mine. These are all PhD graduates, Serene, from your school, Sam Sullivan. And the most progressive church in the city had this national conference with about 40 workshops. At that time, the number for Latinos was 22 million Latinos. Remember that number? 22 million for a long time. And there was not one Latino workshop. Can you believe that? So I organized a demonstration and I took over the church with Ben and Sam and made the event, all the papers. And it was embarrassing for William Kaufman, but he was a good friend. So he took up an offering and said, I support Ray and all these people. Let's take up an offering for them to help them do their own conference. Because what could they say? It was a national conference and they didn't have one Latino workshop. So sometimes you have to confront your own community. Sometimes you have to confront your own community. You have to engage your own community. You have to engage the powers, develop partnerships, but sometimes you have to confront the powers. So let me leave it at there.
Lieutenant Governor, think it's always good to have another elected official on the panel because that's, and Ray gave some examples of that, but that's a piece of how we change the power structure is to get people elected to office. And people don't get elected to office no matter how great they are, just on their own. It really is an operation that takes a dedicated team of people, and as Ray said, that knows not only how to confront, but how to engage. So maybe talk to it from your own experience as an elected official.
Sure. Real quick, when I think of social justice, one of the things when the governor called me to ask me to be a lieutenant governor, one of the things I talked about is the issue that I really would want to focus on is this issue of inclusivity, making sure all people had a seat at the table, all voices mattered, and that we had a economic recovery that was inclusive of all. So I appreciate what you were talking about earlier that you're focusing on because it's directly aligned. But let me say this. I believe, and I'm looking at Reverend Chloe Breyer, I met her because at the time, the former president was ripping children from their parents at the border, and a Texas border, and either putting them on buses or putting them on trains and bringing them separately from their parents at very young ages to my district, the Cayuga Center. I had historically never been involved in immigration issues. It wasn't what I grew up in. Was not the stuff I focused on. I focused on criminal justice, et cetera. And the thing that struck me about that is those children deserve the same opportunities as the children of billionaires, as the children of presidents, as the children of the most well-connected folks in this world. That, to me, is a part of what has to be the underpinning of the conversation around social justice, making sure that we don't allow and let's talk about this spiritually for a second. God has endowed all of us with opportunities, with skills that need to be manifested, that he or she wants us to manifest in this world. And I believe it is our responsibility to provide the right framework and institutional structures to allow everyone to achieve their God-given talents. And unfortunately, that does not happen. And in some cases, and on a large part of some of our history, we have actually done our very best to actually further create oppression and not allowing people to achieve what they've been brought here to do. So for me, that is at the core of what we're saying. So when we talk about, to your very good point earlier, Ruth, when we talk about we're coming out of COVID, getting back to normal, no, we're going to get to something better that's more inclusive, that acknowledges our history. So there's been a lot of conversation about teaching in our schools. As you know, some of our politics have been really driven by this, the conversation around critical race theory, quote unquote, that most people who are saying it have no idea what it is. But what is at the bottom, what is at the heart of the matter is, how do we deal with our history? What gets told, what does not get told, and who's comfortable with that? As many of us know, whenever there's winners and losers, the winner gets to tell the story. And as we have been trying to talk about restorative justice, and we've been trying to talk about bringing us together and making sure that those who have been left out now have a seat at the table, it is hard to do that without deconstructing all of the components that have facilitated this view that some are better than others. And it's as harmful to those who are feeling it as I remember, I didn't learn about my history growing up. I know I'm going a little off topic, but it's important. I'm gonna come back. I didn't learn about my history growing up. I had to come out of school and learn about who I was from people who are not paid to do that. How are we teaching children from K to 12, say we're preparing them for a life and preparing them for a future where they can do their best, and we don't tell them about who they are, and we don't talk about the mistakes that we've made, and we don't do it in a way that is responsible and that sort of affirms that, look, Some are the descendants of people who made very heinous mistakes and decisions. We're not going to hold them hostage to that, but we can't now not allow the descendants of those who have been harmed to not know the history. We have to do that in a responsible way, and I believe that there's faith-based elements to that, and I strongly believe that's a real place for theological seminaries, et cetera, to really insert themselves into the conversation, because it is just something that we are having a hard time doing, and it's going to rip us apart if we don't figure out how to do it well, particularly as we talk about inclusivity and a recovery for all. And so I'm sorry I went a little off topic,
That's okay.
but I guess I just got into the spirit. And
That's good. I think based on Lieutenant Governor's comments, Serena and Fred, we could use an interfaith, and Chloe, we could use an interfaith conference on critical race theory. There are more people on critical race theory. There are more people talking about it and taking positions against it who have absolutely no idea what it is, and all of whom, to pick up on the Lieutenant Governor, all of whom think that their own story should be told, but they don't want to hear a story that makes any of their own people possibly look back. It's craziness. I mean, I will give you an example, is like when I talk and speak on race and racism, one of the obvious examples I talk about is the vast wealth differential between black families and white families. People are usually with me. They may be surprised at the numbers, it's tenfold, but they're with you. And then I say, one of the significant factors here is the issue of home and land ownership. Then they nod. And I say, we had different rules for black veterans than we did for white veterans, and so they couldn't get the mortgages to get the land that would have made them wealthy, people there. And then I say, so who do you think made those rules? And everybody literally looks around, as like, looks in their lap. So let's just be clear, the parents and grandparents of some of us in the white community sat in meetings organized by our federal government that's supposed to be true to our federal democratic principles, and made rules that were fundamentally racially discriminatory over and over and over again. It wasn't just the South, you have to tell people in the North.
That's right.
It was the United States government. And that's just like one of thousands of examples. So,
Can I say something really quickly? I think people really want the truth. We are in we're in a moment in time, particularly with social media, and just particularly as we're just dealing with so much trauma. People want truth. They want, and if you want people to follow you, you have to be a truth teller. We cannot act as if we don't know what's going on and not be actually pursuing truth. Anyway, so I just wanted to throw that in there.
David just gave me 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm going to do a 2-minute summary that includes some of what I was going to say, and I'm going to see if I can do it in 2 minutes. First of all, I really want us all to go out with a couple of things that my co-panelists have said. Winners get to tell the story, and we need to undo some of that and find the rest of the stories and be sure they get heard. The bishop's parallel of engaging and confronting both within our own communities and in the establishment, I think, is really important to hold on to. In terms of the practical issues that are on being discussed today, first of all, there's a large web audience. I want you all to go on the website for NYC 2025, pick the policy papers of most interest to you, read them, and then understand, and Bishop, I know you're going to forgive me for this, that we need to find the place between change can happen now and wait for the Lord to come.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And what's in between those two places is this commitment to organizing and to systemic change. And it involves outside organizing. It involves building movements. It's a place where the faith communities of this city can play a gigantic role. Fred and I are doing this on LGBT issues in the global community. You need faith leaders who are ready to lean in and over time make a difference. And in this city, we need lots of people to lean in and lean on. Elected officials, people in positions of power, sometimes the people behind those elected officials. I want to say very clearly, because it is almost January 1st, that one of the things everyone needs to understand is the structure of city government in New York. So one of the great excitements of right now is that we have a city council that is more than half women, hallelujah, yes. That is dramatically and significantly for the city people of color, and includes several people whose politics are decidedly and visibly progressive. What those people need to understand, and what everyone in this room needs to understand, is that the mayor of the city of New York, by structure and by charter, has an immense amount of power.
That's right.
The council could vote something that people in this room think is like an unbelievable step forward in social justice, and the mayor does not actually have to implement it and fund it unless change has been made at every level, unless people keep organizing and showing their power. And what that means, and faith leaders get this, and faith adherents get this, is that change is slow. I could give you lots of examples. I could tell you that the individual story will make a difference. I could talk about the endless negotiations, which some of you remember every year about the city budget. But I promise you, it's the people standing on the steps of City Hall, literally buttonholing, grabbing the elected officials as they walk in and out, that have something to do with the story. But it only works if those people are organized, if they believe in the change they want to see.
Right.
And they understand that that change is going to come slowly. There's a Jewish teaching that I think probably all of you have heard by now, but it's like, we are not here to realize the end, but we can't refuse to participate. And that's it. It's participation by everybody. It's participation, not just yelling now, as much fun as important as that is, not just being in the streets, but being organized in a way that gets us into the offices and the suites where those decisions are being made.
True.
We have a lot of work to do. We would have a lot of work to do in any event. We have that much more work to do because this is a time when we have to fight in this city, not just for development, but for equity. Thank you. Was the people who were in favor of building the building went and organized in the Black community around sickle cell. That was like, I mean, one of the
Connect the dots.
Exactly. It's my pleasure sitting here.
I have the treatment.
Yeah,
A lot of it. I agree.
it was just a great example of organizing.
So we're going to make a transition to our next panel. And I want to again thank the Lieutenant Governor for being with us, and Bishop Rivera and Ruth Messenger. Great conversation as we're getting settled. Ruth made the comment that we should do a conversation, an interfaith conversation about critical race theory. And critical race theory is actually something that I have taught for years at several institutions. But recently we did an op-ed on it. And if you look, and you're just a casual reader of the Bible, you quickly realize that there's not a story in the Bible, as Bishop Rivera pointed out, that's not about the process of communities being racialized and held captive and struggling for freedom. So if we're not going to teach critical race theory, then we have to take the Bible off the table as a topic for public discussion. So anyway, I am very happy to introduce our next panel. It's on the role of faith-based leaders and religious communities in social justice policymaking in New York City and beyond. And hello once again for those who are joining us online. We're happy to have you here for this conversation today. Our moderator for this panel is Colvin Granum, who is the president and CEO of Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, and formerly the founding president and chief executive officer of Bridge Street Development Corporation, which is a faith-based, not-for-profit community development corporation affiliated with Bridge Street African Methodist Episcopal Church. Our panelists are very close to Union. We have the Reverend Dr. Timothy Atkins Jones, who is professor of preaching or homiletics here at Union Theological Seminary. And he is also senior pastor at Bethany Baptist Church, the historic church in Newark. We are also joined by the Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer, who is executive director of the Interfaith Center of New York and is associate priest at St. Philip's Church in Harlem and is also, we are proud to say, we should put it at the top of her qualifications, that she is a Union PhD graduate. So very proud of Chloe. And we're also so thrilled to be joined by Father Edward Mason, who is pastor of St. Gabriel and St. John Cantus Catholic Church in the East New York section of Brooklyn. And he is a leader with the East Brooklyn congregations and the Metro IAF Industrial Areas Foundation organizing collective. So we are very glad to have assembled this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Colvin to start the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And I just do want to start with a little personal note. I was moved by the invitation to moderate this panel, in part because my undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania was in religious thought. And I ended up going to law school just because I didn't think I would make a good pastor for anybody. And then practiced law for almost 20 years. And then through my church, because of the amount of community activism and community development that was being undertaken by Reverend Dr. Fred Lucas, I became enamored with the space and got my start in community development, as you heard, through creating a community development corporation called Bridge Street Development Corporation. So to come and be with you all, some of my best days were hanging out with theologians and hanging out with pastors. So I'm pleased to be with you. That's what that's about. We didn't get a chance to talk before this panel, but listening to the conversations that have taken place so far, I wanted to dig deeper on two things. One, what is the difference between program and policy? And I'll come back to that in a minute. And two, how do pastors and spiritual leaders get involved? What are the practical steps? We heard about organizing. But I want to talk about, I want you all to talk about, or at least I want people to hear your views on the difference between program and policy. And what prompted me to think about that was that one of the previous speakers talked about food insecurity. And there have been references to housing insecurity. And it is pretty clear that religious leaders have been in the battle around food insecurity, for example. Churches are leading the charge with respect to the provision of free food. They have pantries and all kinds of things. Churches and religious groups have been involved in the provision of affordable housing through the creation of nonprofits and community development corporations. I consider that program. I don't know if you would join me in seeing that as program. But we still have food insecurity after all of this work. And so part of the question to me is, from a policy perspective, how do we create systems change, right? I think what I'm seeing is that churches are involved in program because we see the issue, but and we're making progress. I mean, the program stuff that we're doing is valuable and it's important and it's feeding people, but is there more that can be achieved through policy reform and change to impact systems, and how do people get there? So that's a convoluted question, but I think you get the flavor, and I would start with Reverend Breyer.
I want to go back to thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here, and Union for hosting. Topic, it's near and dear to all of our hearts, I believe. And I think that just to think about your example, and I want to go back to this sanctuary city for a moment, which came up, because I want to, think about it, because I actually think it's a very good example of what you're talking about, because
There was, as many of you remember, a new Sanctuary Coalition, lots of immigration groups. The very fact, though, that immigration was a federal issue and only a matter to do with federal law was the very thing that made it a very interesting challenge for faith groups and others who care about human rights. And I would say that what was at the heart, at least from my perspective, of the sanctuary city was the actual physical houses of worship that took people into sanctuary. Was it something that changed anyone's lives? I don't know. Maybe it kept ICE at bay for an individual family member. Boy, was it an intensive endeavor, however, and a very unpleasant one for all sides. What it did do, however, was to awaken the wider community to what was going on. And I think New Yorkers can be very proud of the way that we made New York City an unpleasant place for immigration and customs enforcement. Because if you remember, by the end of the Trump administration, we had, there were Trump was sicking ICE on a variety of cities, but the fact was we had built such both a faith-based, it wasn't just churches, it was also Hindu temples that made themselves houses of worship. It was sanctuaries of all different kinds and faith traditions. And so there was also a degree of rapid response, so that if ICE, like any other part of the federal bureaucracy, will go to the place where it meets least resistance, we created a lot of resistance. And that's something I think we can be proud of.
Absolutely. I think that as I begin to think about that question of program versus policy, I have to think about the story of Good Samaritan and not simply asking the question, why did the broken person end up on the road, but what allowed that to happen in the first place? What streetlights were off? What gaps existed for someone to end up in that position? And so I really want to share a failure, which is not something I would most often do, but I guess I represent the beyond on the panel, pastoring in Newark. But as we were fighting for marijuana legalization, it became one of the first things in a relatively new pastorate that we became known for in our church. We hosted panels, we marched, we wrote letters, we showed up at City Hall, we showed up at the state legislature. We tried to do everything that we could in order to see some policy change on the front end. I consider it a failure because though marijuana has been legalized in New Jersey, it was done so by the vote as opposed to a policy that came in place before. So that meant that what we really were fighting for, in addition to just its legalization, was for expungement of records, for a certain kind of distribution of all of the money that is inevitably going to come. And so while this was not a situation where I felt like we could really name a victory, we certainly tried to do everything we could from a church's perspective, to the extent that there were folk thought there were ulterior motives for why one might be fighting for marijuana legalization, but nonetheless, that there wasn't really a place where there was programmatic possibility. In fact, as I sit here, I'm not quite sure what a marijuana program would be, but certainly seeing the need to try to have a more just version of the beloved community felt like if we could fight for some justice to come by this, let's do it. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I felt like it was a failure was because there was a lot of, as you might imagine, opposition within the faith community. So this was not one of those issues where there was a kind of unified voice among the faith community. There was opposition even amongst those that held a certain kind of sway and influence, particularly as it related to trying to seek policy change. And so, again, it wasn't a victory, but certainly I think gives an example of the model of the kinds of things we can do to push more towards policy as opposed to programmatic change.
Good morning.
Yeah, you're good.
Good morning. An honor to be here with you this morning. When I was a younger man, I should say, right? Just starting out, graduating college, started teaching in Orchard Hill, Brownsville, East New York, junior high school. Came across the special, which I'm sure we've all heard, give a man a fish, feed it for today, teach a man a fish, feed it for tomorrow. That was it. I was going to save the world, employing that statement. And then I started to grow up and meet reality, other people's reality as well. And so, well, okay, he knows how to fish, but he's got a broken down fishing rod and can't afford a new one. He doesn't have access to water to use the fishing rod that he has. Well, the water that he now has access to is too polluted to eat the fish from it. So what have we done but just raise his frustrations by teaching him how to fish? And even giving him a second-hand fishing rod. That's not it. You know, two words that I took out from the first earlier session was organizing and transformation. And to do that, as I saw early on, is to then get into actual formal ministry, the balance that's necessary, the balance between service and the balance of working for real change. It's ultimately what justice is about. It's changing a system, as we said, that the root cause of it. And it is so easy for well-intentioned, good-hearted, liberal people, for want of a better word, to get into the service aspect. And that's we have to do that. People are starving, you got to feed them. But you also have to ask why. And make a commitment to changing the structures. And as we said earlier, that means looking critically about the present as well as history. You know, critical race theory needs to not be a study of what's happened wrong in the past, but what is still happening wrong today. I think that's proving itself through as the people that oppose it are reinforcing what's wrong today. That might be an easy one to see. But maintaining that balance as we go forward between the actual hands-on service that directed the practitioner, handing someone a bag of food at a food pantry, and then trying to change the structures. And organizing people is what brings about that ability to have transition in their own lives and in society.
I really appreciate the examples that were given regarding sanctuary cities and marijuana. I want to go back to food insecurity. It was because of something that you said, Professor Atkins-Jones, and also Reverend Breyer. You talked about two issues which I think is hard to generate unanimity around, even within church, right? So I can see how your congregation would be like, dude, what are you doing? But food insecurity seems different to me. You know, food insecurity strikes me as a basic human need. Well, food is a basic human need. And it seems like it could be an opportunity, and maybe it's not, to rally a range of faiths around what I would think would be a core principle. But it also has implications like change in how food is accessed, distributed, manufactured, priced, all that stuff, pulls in a range of stakeholders who probably don't want to change the status quo. It's not just a public sector advocacy thing, it's a structures, systems change advocacy piece. So my question is, have faith leaders thought about social justice in that way, like pursuing an outcome that might cause major upheaval? And if so, give me some examples of that, of whether it's even meaningful for us to talk about. Yes, please.
Yeah. Just looking on justice reform, which many faith communities have been heavily involved in, meeting great resistance. And I think everything from the successes and challenges of bail reform, after the George Floyd, finally after 40 years, you got the police to agree to be more transparent about infractions from police officers. That only took 40 years. Right, so, and then you have right now what's going on Rikers Island.
Right.
And the fact that it's the worst human rights abuses since I remember going on to Rikers in 1997 and seeing people, having altercations. And clearly it's gotten worse thanks to the pandemic, the problems with the district of whatever, the DOC. But I think that the idea that we are made in the image of God, which is a a Christian, a Jewish, sort of a, for lack of a better word, an Abrahamic perspective, but that you can find in so many traditions, is a pretty good starting point for most concerns about justice. And as you know, anytime you talk about justice, you're going to be upsetting people. So I would actually say justice reform, and just to be very, focused on the immediate situation, is getting Rikers closed, which will mean getting another 2,000 people not just released, because there's only a certain number that can get into the jails. But so that's an issue that seems to cause a lot of ruckus, but also lands itself squarely. I think there are plenty of people who don't have a religious reason for being objecting to Rikers, but there's a lot of reason too from a faith perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the challenges is when you have the kind of direct charitable ministry, like in a food pantry, there's a sort of immediate tangible result. Someone was hungry, we had a food bag to give them, we give it to them, they leave. I feel like as a parishioner that I've done something, right? I've fulfilled my call today. I can see it in someone who was hungry who now is not hungry. Justice work takes a lot longer, right? And it does not have the immediate kind of tangible benefits. And so it creates a challenge amongst those within our congregations. I'll give you an example that is related to food insecurity. When I was pastoring in New Haven, one of the things that sort of emerged from some faith-based organizing and really just from relationships from different congregations being together was the kind of price gouging that was going on in and around grocery stores, et cetera, that were in the hood, so to speak. And so to begin to address that, it took a lot of work. We had to go and we had to catalog prices, and then we had to bring it back, and then we had to compare it to prices that existed elsewhere. And then we had to push that against prices that we saw in other communities, and on and on and on. And even once you develop all that data, the next steps were not immediately and abundantly clear. Certainly, we still continue to lean on relationships and go to our policymakers and et cetera. And the process goes on and on and on and on. And if you can keep your hands to the plow, amen. But it's a lot more difficult to sell for the congregation to do, hey, come in and join this product, this project, if you will, to try to eventually get to a point where we'll see some different prices within our community. It's probably going to be a 2 or 3 year endeavor. But if we are faithful, it'll come to fruition versus, hey, Tuesday or Thursday, 11 to 1, we have a food pantry going. Won't you come on down and help pass out some food? And so I just want to point out that challenge and the difference of this kind of work and why it's sometimes more difficult. I often find that it's a lot easier for me as pastor to show up at the State House or to show up at this rally or to be on this board of the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice, or it's a lot easier as an individual. But garnering that kind of committed work amongst congregations is a lot of work. And so I think it presents a different kind of challenge.
Father Mason.
I'd like to raise the question for us to ponder: is it even moral to have a food pantry without asking the questions,
right,
why it's needed and what can I do about it? Are we part of the problem,
right,
by distributing food to people without organizing for change? Back in 1980, when EBC was starting out in Brooklyn, one of our first actions was around local supermarkets. One of the fundamental principles of organizing is relationship. And as I'm thinking about this topic here, I'm saying, what are people's relationship to food in their lives? Not to another person, to a system, but to food. And we organized hundreds of people as food inspectors. It was one of the first early actions, first one I was involved in as a young man in 1980. And it was amazing to see poor people, all right? The receivers of society, people of color, walking around supermarkets in East New York, Brownsville, wearing badges, EBC food inspector, with clipboards. And they went around inspecting prices, the condition of meat, expiration date on food. Research was done. We had people in other neighborhoods doing it at the same time. And we were discovering food price differentials. Poorer neighborhoods, browner neighborhoods had higher food prices. The time of the month determined the price of the food as well.
Exactly.
Something we were not necessarily in tune to. So to get people, and try to organize people, but what I saw more than anything was their faces as they walked around the supermarkets those days with those badges on. And then the culminating event was the assembly at one of the churches, several hundred people at it. One of the managers of a local supermarket, I forget the name of it, was there. His district manager came out and fired him in front of that congregation because of their work.
Right.
The change that took place in their lives at that experience, was probably even more important than the fact that we got change in how supermarkets operated as well. Another thing, I don't know if it fits here right now, please tell me. Let's move on. The issue of the pandemic hit. I don't know I lost track of how many funerals and services we had at our church and that I was participating in. I want to say there was not one COVID-related death that I was associated with someone under 60 who was not obese. And the issue of obesity has got to get put on the table with our communities. The systemic reasons for it. It's not just bad eating habits. It's a little more than that. All right. It's about what's available, what's affordable, and that's got to be put on the table as well when we talk about food insecurity and justice.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Just when you were saying that, it reminded me that actually there was 5 years of delivering breakfast to people who were checking in with their parole officers on 100 and whatever, somewhere in Harlem before, and at least for our community in West Harlem. So I just forgot to mention that, but that was a way in, I think.
Yeah. I really, the point that you were making, Father Mason, and I'm not trying to deride or be dismissive or demean the efforts, but the way you frame that isn't moral for us to engage in food pantries only, I think is a powerful perspective on the importance of systems change, because I think some of the things that we do programmatically defers systems change, right? It almost supports the way things are going and continuing to go. And so I think that's part of what we need to examine, but I understand why we're doing it. I do want to say before we conclude this, because I see David's walking towards me already, is that what we're trying to do with New York City 2025 is bring forward ideas around equity and systems change. And I know you're pastoring in New Jersey, but the reason I mention that is because we do need people, right? As a practitioner of community development, I try to get involved in policy. I try to get our organization involved in policy. Actually, I try to get elected officials involved in policy. But it's about data. It's about facts. It's about analysis. It's about really digging deep and understanding. It's about presenting alternatives and not always being anti-something, right? And that's a lot of work. And that's a lot of work even for people who are in the community change business, because it takes a lot of intellectual capital to really be well informed around what should be the right policy. So I just want to invite you all and everybody who's listening to go to the New York City 2025 website and look at those papers. And I'm wondering whether there's a way to organize a partnership between that kind of intellectual and scholarly analysis of what policy alternatives might be in the faith community. I don't know if there already is that kind of partnership. I don't think most of the local pastors I know where to go to fully understand an issue and then take a position and then educate their congregation. So I don't know if there's an opportunity here for NYC 2025 to work with you all in a meaningful way. But I do think it's incumbent upon me to say that. The last thing I wanted to say is I was on that Rikers Island Commission with Jonathan Lippman, and we made the recommendations to it was not just a recommendation to close Rikers. It was a whole range of recommendations around criminal justice reform. But what I wanted to ask you all about, because I think it goes to a lot of what everyone here has been saying, especially Professor Atkins-Jones, is once that recommendation was made, it did cause a lot of divisiveness, right? But in addition to that, when crime started going up, people started saying, forget about closing Rikers, right? Because we think that reducing the amount of people who are incarcerated, is resulting in an increase in crime. Now, the truth is, I don't really think there was anything to do with that the two things were related, but it was a good soundbite. But I think it had an impact on a lot of well-intentioned people. I think a lot of people who were in favor of the initial recommendation started to think maybe that was a mistake. And so my questions to you, I think it really goes to what you were saying, Professor Atkins-Jones, is how do we stay in the battle? You get a victory of sorts, and then there is an opposing force. Sure. And the question is how do you stay in the battle? What resources would you need? How do we work more collaboratively around? Because I think your point is well taken, we need the congregations, right? Because you can be saying one thing and the congregation could be feeling a different thing.
Yes.
How do we deal with that?
So I put my New York hat on here, and I feel like for me, preaching becomes central to this very goal, right? That it takes social justice not as a elective that you do on occasion on certain Sundays or MLK Day, but at the very center of what we teach and preach, really across religious traditions. But the notion of social justice has to be at the forefront. I think it has to be understood as who we are, what we do, and I think that we are obligated to make that connection and bring it full circle to the relationship between program and policy, right? So then to have a food pantry, but then to not only fight for policy change, but also to not have the conversations with those that you are in a position of serving, right? So to serve without them being in community and relationship only continues to foster the distance. Because I think the other challenge that comes with policy work is that ultimately there is a giving up of power. That those that are in a position to give food means that there's a position of privilege, meaning that if there's going to be a change in systems, that inevitably there'll be some power or privilege on my end, even if it's a historic Black congregation, but there still will be some power and privilege on my end that has to be given up. And the only way for that to be understood and to be accepted comes from a sense of community and teaching and preaching within the community. So that has to be something that folk are, even if hesitantly, are willing to do if there's going to be the buy-in for the justice work.
Breyer?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just about congregations. I would say just to tell one little story, because Reverend Sharon White, who was involved in the Rosie's closing, as we all remember, the governor took a very kind of strong step, and one that would cause her in saying, okay, we're going to get them all out of Rosie's and we're going to bring them up to Bedford Hills. And then who is it that the greatest pushback is coming from but all of this, the advocacy organizations, the social service organizations that are like, wait, you're going to disrupt, the individual relationships that people had with access to lawyers, which is totally legitimate. But there was this big pushback on that. And Sharon White, to her credit, and it did not very much articulate, having been there herself, having fought in this battle for so long time. She was like, at some point you got to say, we've got to keep the momentum going. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so powerful, because it doesn't deny the righteous, these horrible situations where the good of a real person is sometimes to the detriment of a larger movement. But she acknowledged that, and she just said, look, I'm not going to condemn the governor. It wasn't the perfect thing to do, no kidding, but we've got to keep this moving. So I think that's why are you smiling?
No, I was just smiling in response to what you said. No.
Yeah. But I think that's that's an example. I mean, pastors can do that or not do that. Lawyers can do that or not do that. It takes leadership. I think that's a good example of leadership.
Father Mason, you want to close us out? I think we're probably at time.
And I think one of the things that I need to do with doing this over 40 plus years is to maintain the balance of approaching it at both levels. Speaking to power, you succeed, and other times you fail. It's a long, arduous battle. But at the same time, we need to focus on affecting individual people's lives and families' lives. Those small victories is what keeps us going, and that's real, and that still happens. So the system isn't quite where it needs to be, but 30 more families this year had a transformation in their lives. Individual people's lives are transformed at the same time. So we're still planting seeds for the future, even though the big battle is not being won that easily. To maintain that balance.
Well, this was very enlightening, and I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope that the folks who are listening and got the same amount of benefit I got. So I want to congratulate all of you on the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to just take a quick 3-minute break just to stretch. If anyone needs to use the restroom, just let me know and I will show you where that's located. Thank you.
I sat right here, I'm gonna sit here again. I think this is what we have to do.
How do we do this? Okay. Good to meet you. I'm Jennifer.
I'm Damaris Whitaker.
Good to meet you. Very good to
Fort
meet you.
Washington Collegiate Church and Collegiate Churches of New York.
So good to meet you. Are we maskless?
All right, welcome back from the break. And again, welcome to all of you who are joining us online for this morning's conversation. I am now very pleased to move into the next portion of the program. NYU Wagner, through its NYC 2025 initiative, assembled a truly remarkable group of academics, policymakers, activists, and nonprofit leaders to develop specific policy proposals to help address social justice concerns. Exactly what we've been talking about this morning. I encourage everyone who's joining us to visit the NYC 2025 website to see the full collection of policy papers. This morning, we will have two of the authors present their recommendations to give you a taste of what is on the website. And with both of these presentations, they will be followed by responses, thoughts, and reflections from community leaders. So our first author is Jennifer Jones Austin. Very glad to have you here, who is president and CEO of FPWA. And the chairperson and commissioner of the NYC Racial Justice Commission. She is going to present a paper on the city's economic recovery must also be a powerful declaration on social justice. What a great title. The respondents to Jennifer's paper will be the Reverend Dr. Damaris Whitaker, who is senior minister at Fort Washington Collegiate Church, a long time church that is friends with Union. We're very glad to have you here this morning.
Thank you.
And we welcome back the Reverend Michael Livingston, who is joining us for a second panel of the day. And just to remind you, Michael is the interim senior minister at the Riverside Church. And he also serves on the board of directors of the National Center for Law and Economic Justice, in addition to all of the things that I mentioned this morning. So I'm now very happy to turn it over to Jennifer Jones Austin for her paper and for the panel's responses. So thank you.
Thank you, President Jones, and thank you, all of you, for being here for what I think is a very important series of conversations. I was glad that I was able to hear the last 10, 15 minutes of the last panel discussion, and I couldn't help but think that it was divinely ordained that I be able to hear it, because what I'm talking about, what I'd like to focus on this morning and have us focus on, dovetails very nicely with the conversation had just before I came up here. It was a perfect segue into this conversation. Over the course of these last 21 months, as our city and our nation have continually wrestled with COVID and its devastating impact, particularly on Black and Brown communities, there's been a lot of talk about a fair and equitable and inclusive recovery. And what often is talked about is, what are the specific policies, the programs, and the initiatives that must be undertaken to ensure an inclusive and fair recovery? What I posit, after having, worked in the poverty-fighting policy and advocacy space for now better than 25 years, is that, time's up. We need to stop talking about simply policy responses to this issue. What I've come to appreciate is that, and I say this as a policy leader and a policy influencer, what COVID laid bare is that it's not that we have policy problems, we have structural problems. We have a society and a system that is designed to keep people of color in a continual state of submission and oppression. And the laws that are on the books are fashioned in such a way as to allow for that no matter what. Policies, and I say this as a policy leader, a policy influencer, policies, when you structurally have inequity, become Band-Aids. They become workarounds. They really do not uproot the cancer at its core. And so the paper that I submitted for the NYU 2025 speaks to some of the work that we must do structurally as a city, and dare I say as a nation, if we are to sustainably address inequity in our society. What I wrote about is a way of examining and addressing and counting poverty here in America and here in New York City. I wrote at length about the existing federal poverty level, which is an antiquated, dated, 50-year plus measure for essentially measuring deprivation, not opportunity, not sufficiency, but deprivation. And it does so by design. Let me make this clear. The federal poverty level says that for a family of 3 living anywhere in the United States of America, that family needs little more than $21,800 to not be considered poor. That federal poverty level then helps to justify a federal minimum wage of $7.25, which when annualized is $15,000. That federal poverty level justifies a minimal amount investment of income supports for housing, for food assistance, for childcare, for transportation. Because what it says for a family of 3 is that if that parent in that family, 1 parent, 2 children, is earning a federal minimum wage of $7.25 when annualized, that being $15,000, then to not be poor and to be doing all right, that person needs only $6,000 plus. So if we provide that in childcare or food supports, that family's doing okay. But what we know here in New York City is that a family of 3 living in the Bronx, to meet their basic needs, childcare, transportation, housing, healthcare, other critical incidentals, needs at least $95,000 in the Bronx. That, my friends, is structured inequity. It's structured racial inequity. Because in a society where disproportionately the people who are struggling and are low income are people of color. So if you use a measure that centers on deprivation, that does not take into account local cost differentials, and you say anywhere here in the United States, a family of four is not living in poverty, earning, $26,800, a family of three, $21,800, then you can justify wage segregation, occupation segregation, wage suppression, the pay differentials for Black and brown women. You can somehow justify that and even put a moral frame around it. It's okay. And then what you can do is say that your underfunded income supports are enough. And so if we are to truly address structural racism and inequity and start to advance a more equitable society, then we need to adopt measures and standards that accurately account for the true cost of living. And we need to do it not from a vantage point of what does someone need in income and income supports, but let's just begin with, what does someone need to earn a wage and a living that allows them to care for themselves and for their families? So we do not set up on a continuing basis this paradigm where a certain class and community of people are ever reliant, and their children ever reliant on a government that is intent on keeping them in a state of oppression. So what my paper speaks to is the advancement of a measure that really looks at the true cost of living and what that would mean by means and ways of wage adequacy. To use that as the base, as the standard for wage adequacy and income supports.
Thank you. I want to respond to that, putting some of the responsibility on those who benefit from tax breaks and privileges in our own neighborhoods, right? Even here in the city of New York. My church is in Washington Heights, and I live in Washington Heights. And the last few years, I was told that I was no longer in Washington Heights, that I was in Hudson Heights. And so I'm not originally from New York, so that was interesting for me to learn that all of a sudden my neighborhood was no longer called Washington Heights, and I was a bit confused. And then I understood that by calling my neighborhood Hudson Heights, people get to charge us more rent in that neighborhood. And because we are on the west side, I was told, of Broadway, not on the east side of Broadway. And so even as we're sitting here, our neighborhoods in the city of New York continue to change demographics rapidly because of this poverty line definition. And how we do that is we continue to raise the rent. We bring in a Starbucks, and we also bring in to a mostly Latinx community a Chipotle. There is a Chipotle in Washington Heights, everyone, which I don't fully understand, but it's there. And so we see how these policies continue to manifest themselves in our neighborhoods to just create and even more accentuate the structural racism, that line that we're hearing about this morning. But I want to talk a little bit about housing, and as it relates to people who are making $21,800 a year or $15,000 a year. And I want to talk about social enterprise. When we, in the city of New York, as an outsider, I've been here about 5 years. I walk around the city of New York and I say it's going to be probably less than a decade before there are like no poor people living in the city of New York, because who can afford an apartment that is a studio for $4,000 a month on a wage of $21,800 a year? But I want to also talk about those people who are living my neighborhood because of these definitions. They are the sons and daughters of Doña Maria, Doña Josefa, that can no longer live in the place where they were brought up, because although they are teachers and they may be nurses and they may be administrative assistants, or they could be police officers, that neighborhood can no longer support, they can no longer pay rent in that neighborhood. And so we have this gap for those who are in the middle, that we are not addressing in a way that's equitable. And I'm gonna just say one last thing and I'll pass it to Reverend Livingston. But what if we were more creative, imaginative? For the last 30 years, I have worked with nonprofit organizations. But we don't talk enough about social enterprising. We don't talk about how can we hold corporations accountable to have a mission. And what a social enterprise is a for-profit corporation that addresses a social justice issue. What if the government would create ways to holding those accountable who are in our neighborhoods in saying, you can get these tax breaks, you can get this if you become a social enterprise, if you raise this poverty line for this neighborhood. When I study business, I want to say to you, I'm a pastor that went to seminary, and when I left seminary, I didn't fully understand what it meant to manage an endowment. So, I'm here at Union Theological Seminary, and I hope that is not the case of our students leaving the seminary, that we don't know how to read a budget document. So I went to business school, and at that time, we were studying, I'm a little bit older than some of the students here, so we were studying what was happening in the world with calling centers. And so we went to India to do that, to Bangalore. And when I went to Bangalore, IBM was bigger than half of Washington Heights. You kept walking and you were still in IBM. You kept walking and you were still in IBM. But what they did there was they made sure, for their own purposes, obviously, that whoever worked there had childcare, had healthcare in the premises, that had transportation, that had a holistic array of services for them to be able to do work and not worry about where is my child going to be if they're sick, where is my child going to be if I cannot get to them. And so here in the United States, while those models may exist here and there, we have not developed a comprehensive way of being and working and really being creative, so that people of color, who are the ones who perhaps cannot have access to childcare to go to work, cannot have access to adequate health care, can really be in a place that not only raises this poverty line, but that understands that for us to live in the city of New York or elsewhere, we require a comprehensive set of services. This is the only way, or one of the ways in which we can change the dynamics of how we attend to those who are, to the Black and brown communities, which obstacles are basically the basic needs, as we heard earlier this morning: the need of food, the need of healthcare, the need of not only having programs, but also having policy change and structures that can cure these inequalities. And I'm just going to stop there, Michael, so you can.
I'm wrong for this panel in so many ways. I don't even want to get into it, but of course I am. First of all, I live in New Jersey, not in New York City. I didn't go to Union Seminary. I'm not even going to say where I went. I know. I'm not even going to say. Damaris knows I have an apartment in Fort Washington, 1/2 block from the Fort Washington Church, in a building that's being gentrified, and I'm one of the gentrifiers. And I'm only able to do it because I'm the pastor of a church that was built by David Rockefeller and still exists on some of the financial foundation that was built into the structure of that church in 1930. The only thing I have going for me is I'm not a white man. Let me tell you a little bit about this apartment. I went there before the pandemic. It's a ridiculous amount of rent. And once the pandemic hit, I went to them and I said, as I'm sure I hope other residents said, we can't afford this. Everything's being compromised, and what are you going to do? And here's what they did. They excused almost 3 months of rent, but they kept the rent for the apartment at the same level, because as soon as the pandemic ends, they're going to go right back to this exorbitant rent that the folks you're talking about, who greet me when I see them in Spanish, and yet you see the new residents coming in who are able to afford those kinds of rents. But what I really want to do is get back to Jennifer, and I want to say, I want us all to stop talking and meeting and just go down to City Hall and sit on the steps and start advocating for the kind of structural change that your paper represents. And it's a brilliant piece of research that's been done there. I actually wanted to go to the table in the index to find out what's happening in New Jersey with some of these these equivalencies around looking at how we understand deprivation, as you so rightly put it, and how we structure budgets that make sense for what it requires of people to actually be able to live and thrive in cities and towns all across the country. We've all seen that graphic that appears on Facebook periodically, and it goes something like, there's not a single state in the country where a family living on minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Not a single state in the whole country. And this is the structural issue that you're talking about and that your paper outlined so well. So I think the question that I'd want to ask you is, what's next? Part of this is pitched at saying something to the new mayor and the new administration that comes in. We can't just give them the paper and expect that the kinds of changes that ought to happen are going to. So I want to partner, I hope we all do, with Union, with Federation of Protestant Welfare Organizations, with Damaris, with Fort Washington, to figure out how we bring some of this to reality. And I'd just love to have you, Jennifer, go pick it up again.
So I'll share that. First, let me just say that, again, I'm excited to see those who are in the audience. And I just want to shout out my fellow commissioner and dear friend, Fred Davey.
Oh, his name's been called too many times this morning already. So just let it go.
And Fred and I have spent the last, we've spent the last many years conspiring on several issues, but in the last 9 months, we've been centering on racial injustice. And one of the things that I appreciate about this moment in our nation, with all the attention being paid on racism, is, and being in this space, in this moment, I'm just going to call it out. We, as people of faith, have to embrace, the spirit of God, the revolutionary, and stop playing these games where we think policies alone are going to do the job, are going to do the trick. Mm-hmm. When Fred and I and 9 other commissioners set out and began the work of the Racial Justice Commission, I and a couple of others had an opportunity to talk with one of the counsels to Bishop Desmond Tutu for the Truth and Race Reconciliation Commission. And one of the things that this individual was quick to point out is that we have to appreciate that these structures, these systems that are held up by these constitutions, were created by people intent on preserving their power and their authority and legitimizing it. And that you have to appreciate, whenever you're trying to dismantle these structures, that these authorities are going to do whatever they need to do to continue to uphold them. So to your point, when you talk about social enterprise, you talk about tax credits and the like, you're right on point. But you've got to remember that the system doesn't really want these tax credits to work for the long term, because then it begins to shift power and it gives people agency that they did not have. And so the Spirit of God, the revolutionary, implores those of us who are allegiant to God only to stand up and speak out and call out these injustices and stop trying to color within the lines, because the coloring book is not designed for us. It's not. So yeah, we got to do the policy work, but we've got to champion these underlying structural issues. Yeah. Fred and I and 9 commissioners are soon to vote on some key structural changes that, if in November 2022 are approved by the New York City electorate, we'll begin to do some of this work. But it has to be a shared aim and objective. And I believe strongly, as a child of the church and of a faith leader who said, that freedom is the ability to say no to a lie, to veto an untruth. Amen. That we have to step into this space. Amen. And start vetoing these lies and saying no to these untruths. Well,
you got to bring that sermon to Riverside, sister. I need to sign you up.
A few years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago, my dad preached a sermon titled God the Revolutionary at the Riverside Church.
You're telling us to stop. Can I say one more little thing really fast? So it's an example of the kind of thing we're talking about in a slightly different context. I talked about this in my sermon Sunday. This kid takes a gun, goes into a school and kills 4 of his classmates, and they're wanting to charge the parents. Okay, I get that, but no conversation about the NRA, no conversation about the congresspersons who benefit from support from the gun industry, no conversation about the Second Amendment. That's structural. It's the kind of thing that you're talking about here. We're not, we got to raise some of these, but there's a whole range of other questions that we're not even beginning to.
And if I may just follow that with this, we are progressive Christians, I am anyway, and we announce, denounce, and we dismantle. But I think we need to announce, denounce, dismantle, and construct. And that's where we sometimes fall short. We don't build well, we dismantle well, we announce well, we denounce well, but how do we reconstruct so that that book is, the coloring book has different lines? That's the work. Thank you, Jennifer, for that, and Union for inviting us, preachers, keeping us in check.
So we're all going to jump on the stage.
Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you.
It's amazing, amazing. Look up self-sufficiency thing.
All right, we're going to move on to our last panel discussion. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. That was great. Yes. And Demarius, and thank you, Michael, for your double duty. And we come to now our second proposal paper discussion on policy. And again, to see a broader spectrum of these papers, if you go to NYC 2025, you can see the numerous papers on policy and NYC that have been written. Our second paper is being discussed by Elizabeth Glazer, who most recently was the director of the NYC Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And she is going to share a paper on safety and opportunity as the touchstones for vibrant civic life. So thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us today. We have two respondents. One is the oft-mentioned Fred Davey, who has been introduced on every panel by those who love and adore all the work that he has done over the years, including most recently now as a senior strategic advisor here at Union, a former executive vice president, and also works with the Interfaith Youth Corps. And among the many things that he does today, in particular, his appointment as the chair of the NYC Civilian Complaint Review Board brings him to this conversation. And we're also joined by Jamie Rubin. Thank you for being with us. Who has served in a variety of senior leadership roles at every level of government and across sectors. That's a very broad way of describing a very large number of areas in which you've been involved. And this includes service as a very difficult job, the commissioner of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So I will turn it over to Liz for her comments, followed by Fred and Jamie's responses. So thank you all for being here.
Great, thanks so much. So I think as Americans and even as New Yorkers, sometimes New Yorkers are slightly separate, we look at safety and opportunity as two separate ventures. You have a crime spike, you call the police. You want opportunity, much more amorphous path, some combination of family, neighborhood, government, nonprofits. And I think that's a big mistake, and that's what my paper talks about, because opportunity and safety are absolutely inextricably linked. And the new mayor has an opportunity to shift the center of gravity of how we make ourselves safe and build a thriving city by shifting from relying first on force in the criminal justice system to instead relying upon an array of civic resources and civilian power of which the criminal justice system is one, but just one strand. And I think when you think about it, the default to the police is so attractive. And to be sure, the police have a role in safety. That's my view. But the default is a problem because it crowds out any other opportunity of how we create safety, and it ignores what have been the really significant social and fiscal costs that we've paid as a nation and as a city. So there's kind of a satisfying simplicity in there's a crime, call the cops, put the guy in jail, and it feels very present and very visible. And it's incredibly well built out. You call 911 for every kind of trouble, from the cat in the tree to the shooting down the block. But the default to the police for everything, even things that we think about as sort of traditional civic functions, and we've seen in our city, the police funded to run community centers, employment centers, has produced a ton of harm, and particularly in communities of color, which have borne the brunt of enforcement. I think everybody knows the incarceration story, both in our country and our city. I think what is less well known is how it has benched a generation and more, particularly of Black men in our city. A third of Black men from poor zip codes are in jail by age 38. And the use of cops to dominate the streets as a way of producing safety has also led to an enormous cynicism, particularly in communities of color, which is reflected, I think, most concretely in the increasing difficulty of, quote, clearing cases, that is, solving cases, which by the middle of the pandemic, the cops were solving 1 in 5 shootings at a time when shootings were off the charts. And that tension between securing your safety through force and the level of disinvestment that I think Jennifer and the previous panel were really talking about has further sort of aggravated cynicism and the withdrawal from participating in public life. If you are a resident of Brownsville and live in a crummy housing development and go to a terrible school and have dilapidated parks, what does that say to you about what your government thinks about you and what your own role is as part of the city? And in New York City, distress of all kinds, we're an incredibly segregated city, and distress of all kinds is remarkably concentrated. So you look at the top 10 neighborhoods that have led the city in shootings for the past 3 decades and more, even though we've become a much safer city, it is the same roll call of neighborhoods. And if you were to overlay that with a map of low birth rates, low graduation rates, high unemployment, it's those same neighborhoods. And these things are linked. And I think on the other side, there is actually a model that has started to be demonstrated in New York City in bits and pieces, but it doesn't have the force of a system. It doesn't have a through line and the power of government behind it. And I focus on government because government, I believe government can be a force for good. It should be, by, for, and with the people. But just very concretely, it is the only recurring source of enormous funds. The city of New York has $100 billion that it spends every year. How it spends it is a policy choice. And if well done, it has the network to deliver civic services. It's in every borough. There are how many city employees? Over 300,000? And so on the other side, I would say that an investment in civic services first is a way to iteratively shrink the touch that the criminal justice system has on people because you're producing productive and thriving lives. This is essentially what the Kerner Commission said in 1968 when they said, how do we move away from two societies, separate and unequal, black and white? A massive investment in social infrastructure, which never happened, of course. But the evidence that we have since the Kerner Commission, random controlled trials, research, and just personal experience is both that there are individual pieces that create safety, right? A study 2 years ago showed that lighting in New York City Housing Authority buildings reduces nighttime violent crime by 30%. Jobs in New York City, summer youth employment, reduces deaths among young people as well as arrests. Supportive housing interrupts the cycle of homelessness, mental illness, and jail. And systemically in New York, we have also started to put together some really interesting systems that address how we deal with safety from the community up, from the neighborhood up, by putting together civic resources, of which policing is one, but not the dominant force. So I recommend that we have a deputy mayor for justice, somebody who singularly is able to not only organize the criminal justice players, many of whom are independent and answer to different bosses, but to organize and orient them in a very concentrated way towards specific goals, and not just about policing, but how much we use jails, how much we use prosecution, what those judgments are, but who also is able to work with his or her colleagues who control civic assets in order to be able to put together a blended strategy that has both a structure that is as visible and responsive as police, but is rooted in civic and civilian resources, and to essentially pressure test every dollar, whether it's for patrol or for jobs, for the amount of safety that it produces for New Yorkers.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. I got really excited about when I read your paper. I mean, I was really inspired by it. Before I respond, let me just acknowledge all of my colleagues from my long journey here in New York City who are in this room, and how much I appreciate each of them, and also thank David and others for organizing this day. I want to focus just on primarily on the deputy mayor position that you mentioned, that you write about fairly extensively in the paper.
I only ever write extensively.
I'm sorry?
I only ever write extensively, unfortunately.
Well, you do it inspirationally, so I appreciate that. Just a word about the qualifications, a word about scope of work, and then just kind of leave it at that, all within the context of what I'm doing now. So, first of all, I just really appreciate that you've clearly articulated that we need this position here in New York. I am serving on the Mayor-elect's transition team and on the Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee of that transition team. So if the title for the position had to be Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, I would accept that. It's just important that we have it and that it focuses on the issues that you have discussed. I would actually raise two more, and again, they're related to things that I'm involved in, and my colleague Jennifer Jones-Austin has mentioned one. So the first one would be civilian oversight of police. which I think is extremely important and would increase the amount of trust, has the potential to increase the trust between the police and the community. You reference in your paper that it's been very hard to get people in community to actually assist police in investigations because that trust doesn't exist, or doesn't exist to the extent that it needs in order to get people to actually to respond to police around crimes in communities. I would suggest that there's a civilian oversight, a robust civilian oversight, could increase that trust. I believe we've done some of that at the CCRB with things like the repeal of Public Law 50A that allows for more transparency in sharing information about the disciplinary records of the department. I believe the agency's ability to investigate false official statements by officers expands and increases the authority of civilian oversight, the ability to investigate sexual misconduct by officers, racial profiling, etc. An area where I believe a deputy mayor for public safety and justice could also help with civilian oversight is looking at the CCRB's need for final authority over the disciplinary decisions it makes. Now, we made great progress in that regard with this mayor and this police commissioner when we signed a memorandum of understanding that said any of the recommended penalties that the CCRB transmits to the department would be adhered to unless there are extraordinary circumstances for that not to be the case. The challenge we found in having done that historic, as the mayor likes to say, unprecedented, which it was, memorandum of understanding, is that there's still a hole that the department can drive through, and that is because the commissioner has final authority, and I like Dermot Shea. I know he gets a bad rap, but I don't think he's a bad person. But as long as the commissioner has final authority on discipline, they can reverse the substantiations, in other words, the guilty verdicts that the CCRB reaches before we send a case to the department for the penalty to be determined, and so they never have to determine the penalty. So in order to really address this gap, there's got to be some kind of final authority for civilian oversight, which I think a deputy mayor for public safety and justice could actually help us pursue. I have a suggestion, and that would be, rather than dealing with legislation, let's do another memorandum of understanding that says not only when it comes to sentencing of police officers for infractions as recommended by the CCRB, will the department adhere to that unless there are extraordinary circumstances, but also they will adhere to the conclusions we've reached. In other words, if we substantiate allegation, the department will adhere to that unless there are extraordinary circumstances for doing otherwise. So that would be one piece. So let's strengthen civilian oversight. Let's put that under this deputy mayor. The other has to do with what my colleague Jennifer Jones-Austin raised as chair of our Racial Justice Commission. And I hope I'm not going to spill the beans, but since they were so clearly laid out in a number of papers this morning, I think someone's already ahead of me. But one of the recommendations of this, and David says I'm talking too long, so I'll do this quickly. One of the recommendations of the Racial Justice Commission that's in the papers this morning that will be in the recommendations I think we're voting on Thursday is for the establishment of a CCRB-like watchdog for equity in the city, for racial equity in the city, to make sure that first of all, agencies all have equity plans, and secondly, to make sure they're implementing them. If they're not, this watchdog would take note of that and recommend sort of remediation to make sure agencies do live up to what they're supposed to do. So I would propose that this piece of new city work, should the voters approve it in November 2022, should be also under the auspices of this deputy mayor for what I would call public safety and justice, and a part of that person's responsibility. I can say more, but I've talked too long already, and I'll turn it to Jamie.
Got it. So I'll thank you very much, Fred. I'll be quick, and I should say I don't have anything like the depth of experience or credibility of either of my two colleagues on the panel in terms of in the area of criminal justice. I do have a lot of government service at the state level. I was housing commissioner, and I've been involved in a number of other issues, as was said earlier. So I thought what I would do is make a couple of broad observations about the paper from that vantage point, and then a couple of specific observations about the paper based on what I am involved in criminal justice. I'm the chairman of the board of the Osborne Association, which many of you know, which gives me a little bit of a perspective. I thought, first of all, it's a remarkable paper. I said to Liz last night by email, I thought it was extremely clearly written, which is to be treasured. Something Liz said when she spoke earlier really struck me, which is where government shows up. The government decisions that government makes in policy, in budgets, are policy decisions. I would say also that where government shows up shows what government really cares about. And I'm always struck by the example of outdoor dining randomly, which was implemented with extraordinary alacrity the moment practically COVID shut all the restaurants down or threatened to. It was a widely easy, it looked like a very easy thing to do. It's incredibly complicated. Somehow government managed to make it happen, and it stuck 2 years later. I contrast that with the recommendation to attempt to close Rikers Island, which strikes me as being inarguably it's something we should do yesterday, and it's obviously extraordinarily complicated, but Liz in a different setting has had, I think it's a 6 or 7 point plan that shows quite clearly how one can close Rikers Island without going through some of the machinations and the difficult community stuff that the mayor has gone through, forgive me. And I completely agree. It strikes me that Rikers closing is something that is exactly the kind of thing that government should do. It's concrete and it's an achievable goal. It's not solving criminal justice issues. It's not, solving public safety inequities for all time to come. It's closing Rikers Island. That's something the government should be able to get its arms around if it can figure out how to do outdoor dining. So a couple of quick points just with respect to Liz's paper. Politically, it strikes me that the most difficult thing about the arguments that you're making is the counter arguments that you get, two of which I guess I would say are the ones that strike me. One is just the general perception that public safety is a fundamental pillar of economic growth from the business community and other people, which is something I just think you have to be aware of is out there as a counter argument. And the other is the perception, and I think this came up during the George Floyd period to some extent, and the the argument about defund versus not defund, that the strongest, this is just perception, that the strongest advocates for police reform were people who were a small vocal minority, and that in fact most people in the communities that were most affected by crime were in fact supportive of more, not less, public safety. I don't have any reason to think that that's accurate or true, but I do think that was a perception that emerged, and I think it's just something that you're combating when you talk about the need to make change. I fully support all your ideas about a new deputy mayor and Fred's amendments to them. I think those are clearly things that have to happen. And then finally, I would say just for my work with Osborne, I'd love to hear more about your views on recidivism and the impact of reducing recidivism can have as a specific intervention in reducing crime levels even further and keeping the jail population down. So thank you. That was a spectacular paper.
So those are all such great comments, and so I would sort of weave them together. Oh, we're done. See me after class. I have so much to say.
God intervened.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And Liz, thank you again for the paper. I would encourage everybody, if you haven't read it, people out there online, find the paper. It's really phenomenal, and it's a really good roadmap for us, I think, going forward. So thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Nice to see you.
And thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to more conversations. Bye-bye.
Sorry.